Hello and welcome to Drunk on Tea. Necromunda originally released in 1995 and is still a popular game today. Although the style has changed from a more punk aesthetic to a more grimy one, with the bright colours being replaced by much darker tones, and no more goblin green bases, and the legendary cardboard scenery being replaced by plastic, the core of the game still remains the same. Today I'm painting one of the plastic Orlock miniatures that came in the original starter set. I'll be taking this mini and giving it an updated colour scheme, but still keeping that retro look to bridge the gap between retro and modern Necromunda. So join me as I step into the Underhive and bring a 30-year-old model to life in the modern day. The first thing I've done is prime the mini black, a change from the white that these minis were often primed in when they first came out. And with Cadian flesh tone, I'm painting all of the skin. It's going to take a couple of layers to get a solid cover all over the skin. I'm working in a few thin layers because a lot of the details on this mini aren't very pronounced, so by using thin layers I'll be able to keep as much of the detail that there is as possible. I'm painting all of the face as well as the exposed neck and the arms on the mini. I'll be using a lot of layer paints for this model as they are brighter than a lot of the base layers, and they'll really give me that classic brighter look that the models were originally painted with. Using layer paints as a base paint is fine, they'll probably just take a couple more layers to get a solid cover. With the skin painted, you can see that bright look I'm going for. Now with Calgar blue, I'm going to paint the trousers. This is a really bright blue and it's going to give me that pop of colour. At the moment, with a lot of this model still being black, it may look too bright, but as the other colours are painted, the blue will fit in with the rest of the model, and at the end, this Orlock will really have that retro 90s punk look of classic GW. I'm being careful around the other details, making sure I only paint the trousers with this blue. And much like the skin, this is a thin layer paint, so I'm slowly building up over 3 or so layers until I get a solid cover all over the trousers. With the trousers painted, adding a pop of colour. Now with Evil Sun Scarlet, I'm going to paint the shirt and bandanas. I'm trying to avoid painting over any of the chain or other details as I paint the shirt red. I had to add in some red as so many of the models from this era had something painted red, which is why it's often called the Red Era. This red will also add another pop of colour and some interest to the mini. I'm also painting the bandana on his head with Evil Sun Scarlet, building up to a solid coat in a few layers and being especially careful to avoid painting over the skin. I'm also painting this bit of fabric hanging from his waist. This could be painted different colours to help mark different members of the gang, but for this model I'm keeping it simple and painting it the same colour as his shirt. Any other bits of fabric like the ones on his arms and legs I'm also catching with some Evil Sun Scarlet as well, making sure I build up to a solid coat. With the red painted, that retro look is really coming along. Now with Corvus Black, I'm painting the jacket. This will give the Orlock that biker look, which is still a part of their design, even today. I'm also painting the gloves, being very careful around the skin so I don't have to come back and tidy up. And I'm painting the boots with Corvus Black as well. These darker areas will contrast well with the lighter bits I've already painted. Now that the large areas are painted, it's time to pick out some details. With Avalan Sunset, I'm painting the skulls on the model. All models from this era had some skulls on them somewhere, and I'm picking out these trinkets with yellow. A lot of details that are painted gold now used to be painted yellow. Think about 2nd edition Ultramarine Aquillas and trim, so to keep that retro look, I'm going to paint these skull trinkets on the model with yellow. With the skulls painted, next I'm going to paint the hair and leather, and I'm using Mournfang brown for this. First I'm painting the hair with a few layers of brown, being careful to not accidentally paint over the red bandana, but making sure I get a solid coat. I'm also painting the pistol holster on his hip, as always being careful around other colours, but making sure in a few layers I build up to solid coverage. And I'm painting the belt as well. This is quite a small detail, so I'm being very careful. Part of the belt is an ammo strap as well, so I'm catching that with Mornfang Brown. With the hair and leather painted, next I'm going to pick out metallic details. With lead belcher first, I'm going to paint all over the weapon. Different guns have different looks, some having a casing that I would paint a different colour, but this one can all be painted with lead belcher. This is where I'm glad of modern paints. Painting these originally with mithril silver was awful. That paint had just the worst coverage. I'm also painting all over the blades to his knife, or is it a sword? The scale on some of these old models was crazy, and plastic moulding wasn't at the level it is today to create tiny little details like small knives. And I'm also picking out the plates on his jacket and any chains. It may take a couple of layers to get a solid metal layer over these details, but after the first layer dries, I'll paint them again until I get a solid coat. With the lead belcher applied, there is just one more base coat left, and that's some Retributor armour. I'm painting the details around the handle to his knife, as well as the knuckle duster guard. By using the gold paint here, I'm mixing the retro bright look with a more modern style, which is going to give this model a unique look. I'm also painting the shell casings on the belt with Retributor armour. With the gold painted, that's all of the base coats, so the next step is to apply some shades. With Reikland Flesh Shade first, I'm shading the skin. This will add some definition to the skin, but as I use Cadian Flesh Tone for the base, it will still have a lighter look than if I'd painted it originally with Bugman's Glow. I don't want this to fall heavily, just sink into any recesses and add some definition to the model, and hopefully not darken down the skin too much, so I can apply some retro style highlights. Now with Known Oil, I'm shading everything else. I'm applying this to the hair and the bandana, and all over the metal details, as well as everything I paint with red, yellow, brown, black and the blue trousers. Once again, I don't want heavy pooling, just for the shade to add definition to the model. This way I won't have to brighten areas back up too much, and I can just apply some old school style highlights to bring this classic model to a modern tabletop. If you're enjoying the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And if you'd like to support the channel, please become a member by pressing the join button down below or joining me over on Patreon. Once the shades have dried, you can see how they've added definition to an otherwise quite flat looking mini. Now with Kislev Flesh, I'm highlighting the skin. I'm applying small highlights to the sharpest points, like the nose, eyebrows, bottom lip and chin. This will work well with the Cadian Flesh Tone and the shade to give a nice looking skin where the features stand out, but also keeping the paint scheme simple and in the style of a lot of models from the 90s. On the arms, I'm picking out the edges of muscles and sharp details just to add that extra bit of definition and interest to the model. So where there are pronounced muscles or sharper areas, I'm applying a small, thin and quite light edge highlight of Kislev Flesh to make these details stand out. With the skin highlighted and the facial features standing out. With Rust Grey, I'm highlighting the trousers. Much like the skin, I'm picking out the most raised edges of details, like creases and folds, and catching them with a highlight of Rust Grey. I want these features to stand out, but without being too cartoonishly bright that would take away from the model. So all of the tops of folds, I'm catching them with a thin highlight, being light with my brush so I don't leave too much paint, and the paint won't run away from me and end up in other areas. Just carefully picking out the details with Rust Grey. With the trousers highlighted, I'm going to highlight the red fabric, and I'm using Wild Rider Red for this. On the bandana, I'm catching the edges of the fabric and the knot, and also the top and bottom of the bandana, being careful around the hair. For the fabric hanging from his waist, I'm catching the very edges with a highlight, using the side of my brush where I can to keep an even highlight all the way along, and I'm also highlighting the tops of the folds, where the shade has settled into the recess, and with some of the Evil Sun Scarlet showing as well. Catching just the very tops and edges will add some interest and texture to the fabric. I'm also highlighting the fabric on his arm and leg as well, as I did for the bandana, catching the edges of details on the top and bottom edges of the fabric with a thin edge highlight. With the red highlight, this model is really coming together already. Now with Mechanica Standard Grey, catching the edges to the jacket, once again keeping these lines nice and thin, but catching the very edge with a small highlight of grey. I'm also highlighting the gloves, picking out the edges of any details and applying a small highlight onto the knuckles and any joint of the fingers. This will add a bit more definition to the hands and really sell the impression of him wearing gloves. For the boots, I'm highlighting all of the details and the toes with a thin highlight of Mechanica Standard Grey. I'm keeping these lines really thin so they just look like light, catching the details, and they won't end up reading as grey. With the black highlighted, it's time to highlight the smaller details. With Dawn Yellow, I'm going to highlight the skulls. As these are small details without a lot of texture, I'm just applying a small highlight to areas like the top of the skull and around the mouth and eyes. These details are very flat, so just a few select highlights should bring out the details, but leave a lot of the original yellow showing, giving that retro look to these trinkets. Now the yellow is highlighted, I'm moving on to the hair next. With some XV88, I'm carefully dry brushing over the hair. I'm using a small flat brush to catch all of the detailing in the hair, but avoiding accidentally painting over the bandana. So I'm keeping the brush under control as I sweep back and forth over the details, letting the dry brush do the work of picking out the details. Now with Scrag Brown, I'm highlighting the pistol holster and the belt. I'm catching the sharp edges using the side of my brush where I can to get a smooth even highlight on the holster. And for the belt, I'm catching the top and bottom of the belt with a really thin highlight to make it stand out and keep these lines as small as I can. Now that the leather's highlighted, there's just a couple of highlights left to apply. With Liberator Gold, I'm picking out a few sharp points on the handle to the knife with a few spot highlights. Any sharp corners and the raised parts to the knuckle duster area, I'm applying a small spot where the light would catch. And on the shell casings, I'm catching the top and bottom with some bright gold. Now the gold's highlighted, all that's left are the final metal details, and I'm using Stormhost Silver for these. For the gun, I'm catching any sharp edges to the body of the gun or any details. This highlight will give the impression of light catching off the sharp edges. These highlights don't have to be everywhere, just a few select details will really add some interest. I'm catching all of the edges to the blade of the knife using the side of my brush for larger areas, but others I'll have to use the tip of my brush. This will make the knife look like it's really sharp and ready to do some damage for House Orlock. Finally, I'm catching the edges to metal plates on the jacket, as well as any prominent links in the chains as well. I'm keeping the highlights nice and small, but making sure I catch all of the metal details with some Stormhost Silver. And with those highlights applied, that is how to paint a 30-year-old Orlock model in a modern paint style that still has nods to its retro past. Let me know in the comments, what do you think of this scheme mixing old and new? And do you play Necromunda, either the original or the modern version? But thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to see more painting videos for both retro minis as well as modern ones. And happy painting!